Hello, everyone. We're gonna start in a couple of minutes, and we're gonna wait. So we get started at 4 p.m. sharp. Thank you for the people that are already here. We'll be starting very soon. So I think maybe we can get started. Thank you for everyone that's connecting at this moment. My name is Enrique Cavalier, and I have the honor to be joined by Sol Perez. I'm going to introduce her. So thank you for everyone. And this is the second day of the symposium, Awkward Practices, Prácticas Incómodas. The first day happened on Saturday with a talk in Spanish with 4 practices in Colombia. You can find the link on the description below, where we've had a really interesting conversation. So as I was saying, my name is Enrique Cavalier. I am an architect and researcher from Bogota, Colombia, and I'm currently finishing my MA in situated practice at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. I'm joined here with Sol Perez. She's an architect, researcher, and educator. Currently, she is candidate at UCL in joint supervision with the Bartlett School of Architecture and the Institute of Education. Sol also works as an architecture consultant in London and Santiago in Chile, and as a researcher at UCL. Before living in London, Sol lectured in Universidad Católica de Chile and ran an architectural practice where she and her firm partners had the opportunity to develop projects for private clients and the Chilean government. Their last public building was a school in the south of Chile that encouraged her research about environments, engagement, and education. Her long-term goal is to create awareness of how spaces affect the way people live. So hopefully in the future, more citizens engage in the construction of the environment that's around them. Thank you, Sol, for joining us in this discussion.
Thank you, Enrique, for inviting us. It's me, yeah.
So the schedule for today, I'm gonna present a little bit this idea of awkward practices. Then I'm going to show a small presentation, which kind of resume kind of the discussion that happened on Saturday. And then I'm gonna give Sol the opportunity to talk about her practice and research, and then we're gonna have a 20-minute discussion. So hopefully we're gonna stick to time and enjoy this wonderful conversation. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen so we can get started. Also, we have a live chat on YouTube. If we're gonna have at the end also 5 minutes for questions and comments. But if the audience wants to engage in the conversation, we will be reading them and engaging during during this whole hour. So let me share my screen. Okay. So as I was saying, this is a two-day symposium that started on Saturday. and today is the second and last day of the symposium. On Saturday, I was joined by Arquitectura Expandida, Golpe Barrio, Ruta 4, Convite, and Carlos Medellín, different practices in Colombia that are discussing this idea of awkward practices. So in the last few decades, we have witnessed the expansion of urbanization across the globe. And contrary to this kind of promise of amelioration of living condition than this kind of urban migration once represented, the living conditions in cities have deteriorated, and a large part of this population suffer from inequality, access to proper housing, and we've seen how many cities have also presence the continuous gentrification movement. There are a lot of community displacements and a growth of informal settlements. And we have seen how, faced with these growing processes caused by cities and the inability of traditional urban practices to intervene, how dwellers are unifying under collective organization and associations to claim the right to the city in the context of Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey. And this movement have produced an urban culture around the globe claiming a power of new urbanization process. And so awkward practices emerges in the overlapping of the planned city, traditional urban planning and architecture, and the urban cultures of the community, engagement, management, borderline communities, and projects. So this is kind of the idea of awkward. This expression or moment arose in one of the conversation when I was preparing for this talk. I was talking to Anna, one of the participants, and we were talking how uncomfortable we felt with our profession because many times we're introducing our work, and even the communities we work with or our fellow colleagues don't really understand how this fit in the context of architecture. And this kind of awkward moment of you don't understanding your role and questioning your role and reality, but also you are making this traditional practice and formations awkward and uncomfortable. So on Saturday, as I was saying, I was there as Publico, my personal project and practice. Publico is a space in Cajicá, Colombia, that I found and managed with the community there to encourage people to become active agents in the construction of their city by sponsoring, developing, and supporting community-led projects. On the left, on the middle, we see Carlos Medellín. He's an architect interested in social engagement, community participation, and individual empowerment. He approaches architecture as a social practice. Through design, he explores how spaces can address the structural inequality that shapes our society. And in the left, we have Arquitectura Expandida and Golpe Barrio, which are an activist action research collective reclaiming the right to the city and territory. And Golpe Barrio, it's a hip hop group in Bogota. On the bottom left, we see Ruta 4 Taller. It's a small architecture and research studio from Pereira, a small city in the coffee region of Colombia. And on the bottom right, Sara as member of Convite a Medellín interdisciplinary team that practices architecture as a cooperative process. So these practices of architects, artists, designers, municipal authorities, community leaders, as as I say, they feel uncomfortable with their professional training and make their professional colleagues uncomfortable. And the tactics they use to practice are around this, the idea of appropriation, building and design, maintenance and exchange, through the creative appropriation of public spaces, the design of spaces to meet and exchange and dialogue, and this kind of creation of infrastructures to share knowledges and materials, spaces to communicate and engage with local communities, and moments to appropriate and engage in the public discourse. And as I was saying, these practices are mediating and translating between the formal practice of architecture, but also and city, but also with the urban culture and kind of inhabitation of the city. These are, I'm going very fast, but the idea is to show kind of their process and projects fast so we can get into the conversation. This is more like a, but this is the project. For example, this is a project in Bogota by Arquitectura Expandida, where they're using the language of architecture, of using maps and plans to talk and engage with the community and see how the city, the formal city, interweaves with the existing and local communities. This is one of the projects by the Convite, where they are using kind of the technical knowledge from architecture school, mixing them with how people building their communities. And this is kind of the spaces where these practices are engaging between what they say on the left, the formal and built city, and on the left, the more informal settlements. And how this is a project where they were showing how this was a self-generated and management project in Bogota, where the community had designed and built a BMX track, and now it's being destroyed by the government to give place to a new park. So these kind of moments of friction between the plan and the informal. So this was a very brief kind of discussion about what happened and project. I encourage you to go and learn more about their projects. On the description below, you can see the links to their practices. But I want to now give the space for Sol to engage.
Thank you so much, Enrique. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share screen now, so hopefully it will work well. So, 1 second. So can you see my screen, the slide?
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Enrique, for inviting me to this event today, and for such a thought-provoking event on Saturday. It's a moment that you wish that everyone could speak Spanish as well, to be able to enjoy such a rich wealth of knowledge that was coming from those practices. So as Enrique said, I'm Sol Perez Martinez. I'm a Chilean architect and researcher. I'm finishing at the moment a PhD at the Bartlett School of Architecture and the Institute of Education. In this 15 minutes, I want to very briefly talk about the series of events that took me to my PhD research topic, reflecting on the question posed by Carlos Medellin on the event on Saturday. Then I'll present a couple of initiatives that I examined in my research, and I'll finish with a set of references that have helped me to navigate this awkward journey. Carlos Medellin asked to the speakers on Saturday, what makes you feel uncomfortable about practicing architecture? This question and the clever title of this event resonates with my lived experience. I think that feeling awkward or uncomfortable with architecture practices has pushed me to keep moving, researching, exploring, and even like moving as far away as I am now from my home country to keep trying to explore this, why I feel uncomfortable, and try to find a comfortable place in my architectural practice. For me, it all starts in the courtyard in this architecture school back in Chile. While studying architecture, I felt uncomfortable with the disconnection of what was happening in this beautiful and really fun oasis and what was happening outside. We seemed to study architecture disconnected from real life problems, floating on a detached bubble of privilege. As a result, I started working in architecture firms at 18 to understand what was happening outside. Soon after, at 25, with a couple of friends, we set up an architecture firm, eager to learn by doing and from the world outside. After our first year in practice, Chile was struck by one of the biggest recorded earthquakes in history. As a young firm interested in the public realm, we wanted to get involved in the reconstruction of public buildings destroyed in the earthquake. We were lucky to win a couple of public competitions and had the opportunity to build a town hall and a school in the south of Chile. However, during the development of the projects, there were two problems that made me feel deeply uncomfortable. First, my gender in an all-men team was a problem to the degree that it took out the joy of practicing completely. And secondly, once developing this project, it was uncomfortable to participate in a design process where communities didn't fully participate and there were strong power asymmetries. The consultation meeting for a school was one of the most awkward meetings of my working life. So I think that that's why this idea of the awkward practice, like it really resonates for me. Due to my lack of preparation to lead a participatory process and the awkwardness of those invited to participate in the design. However, this uncomfortable meeting and the problems it revealed prompted my research about civic engagement in architecture and the built environment. Meanwhile, in other parts of Chile, heritage towns were completely destroyed, like you see in the picture here. Vertical ghettos were built in many, many cities, very similar to what we were seeing on Saturday in Colombia as well. And multiple questionable private developments were popping everywhere in Chile. All these uncomfortable buildings are here to stay. The damage is done. But so I guess that the question for me is what to do to make this stop before it happens. My hunch was that only large groups of active citizens could engage and change these practices. But how could we organize and act collectively? To cut a long story short, in 2013, I came to the UK to look for new practices to engage citizens in architecture and the built environment. However, how do you unlearn all these uncomfortable lessons dragging from architecture school and reinforced by architecture practice? This PhD journey for me has been a really awkward one. By moving away from the comfort of architectural practice, the trade that I know, it is like jumping to a void where the tricks of your trade are not useful anymore. And I guess that we all need preparation to engage in a new practice that we don't know. So my way of engaging in that was to search back in history to find other people's experiences that could guide me. And after a while, I found the Urban Study Centers network, and within it, many voices who shared a very similar journey back in the 70s. Through oral and public history, I have researched the Urban Study Centers network, an initiative that brought together architects, planners, geographers, artists, and teachers during more than 20 years to engage people in architecture and urban change. With almost 40 centers spread around towns and cities in the United Kingdom, it seems rather surprising that this experience has remained untold by architectural and educational histories. However, even though the Urban Study Centers had been considered a minor project by historical narratives until now, this experience of all these people in this graph is significant today when new groups are trying to revive similar methods of engagement. But first, before delving in, I would like to set up the scene. After years of shortages and difficulties due to the war, the 1960s was a decade characterized by economic prosperity and affluence, thanks to post-war recovery and full employment. However, the changes of Britain's global position in the economic market and the decline of the empire were two problems that were simmering underneath the surface and that would unleash a crisis in the following decade. Furthermore, wartime destruction put heavy restraint in cities, generating housing shortages for decades. Planning doctrines became problematic when slum clearance and the destruction of established communities were replaced by high-rise public housing and motorways. While officials felt positive about their housing programs, discontent was rising amongst residents who had to deal with waiting lists, displacements, and the perils of high-rise blocks, as you can see here in the picture. Planning proposals were increasingly confronted by public rejection, making the residents' opinion almost unavoidable. The repetition of the situations gained the government's attention and gave way to discussions about participation and the effect of planning over the environment. The demonstrations against redevelopment made clear that citizens were engaged with their local built environment, but the government didn't know how to transfer this interest into planning or design processes. As a result, in 1968, Arthur Skeffington was asked to lead a commission to tackle the best way of securing public participation. A year later, the Skeffington report was delivered to offer local authorities and councils methods to inform and include people's views in their projects. Following the report, community consultation became a required step in the planning process. As Dennis Hardy explains, planning committees weren't able to openly dismiss people's opinions anymore. However, Joan Keane argues that tokenism and failed participation exercise led many to think that participation was simply not enough and that education was a necessary prerequisite. The effect of the report was twofold. Firstly, several planning departments hired professionals to mediate planning proposals to teachers and children. And secondly, it made an argument for organizations related to the built environment to develop their own educational proposals. The most influential organization in this respect was the Town and Country Planning Association. During the 1970s, the TCPA set up planning aid and an educational unit that led the debate with innovative experiments. This was possible to a great degree thanks to the leadership and advocacy of its educational officer, Colin Ward. Colin Ward, here in the picture, was an anarchist writer and educator who worked for many years in architecture firms. For him, engagement with the built environment was important not only for its aesthetic dimension, but also because it encoded power relations in a visible form. Ward combined education and built environment know-how with an anarchist background. The team was completed with his deputy officer, Tony Fison, a planner and geography teacher, and Eileen Adams, a teacher who developed a pioneering program in collaboration with council architects. One of the main aims of the education unit was to advocate for the creation of urban study centers in towns and cities of Britain. Urban study centers were local independent organizations that provided resources and a meeting space for communities, and especially young people, to become aware, skilled, and take action over the built environment. They were developed based on the idea that only a citizenry with environmental literacy would be able to participate meaningfully in the construction of their surroundings. To set up the center, the TCPA encouraged the use of derelict buildings in city centers abandoned during the crisis. The centers could suit the following purposes: a learning base for visiting and local schools, a connector between planners and people as a space for planning consultation, a venue for community forums, an archive for urban resources, but mainly a catalyst for meaningful urban change. The pedagogical activities in the urban study centers used the local built environment as a primary resource and were based on interdisciplinary collaboration between environmental professionals and teachers. Through the urban study centers, Ward advocated for issue-based learning and place-based methods, which gave an active role to the learner and considered learning as a situated practice. To support the creation of the urban study centers, Ward and Fison established a council for urban study centers with MPs, professors, advisors, and trustees. By 1980, there were 31 centers established across the UK, and many more were in the making. The lack of a defined framework and an overarching institution made the centers vary in structure, scale, activities, and funding, depending on their context. The centers worked as a flexible archive of resources to explore the urban environment. therefore dependent of the material available in its locality and the group of people who were involved in it. But more importantly, the centers responded to a popular unrest related to urban problems as a result of decades of top-down planning. They had the double function of integrating citizens in the building process, while at the same time made professionals aware of the relevance of hearing people's needs. Now I would like to quickly show two urban study centers in London to illustrate these ideas. In the bottom right corner, you can see the Nottingdale Urban Study Centre in West London. Here is Chris Webb, who became the director of the first Urban Study Centre in December 1974, pretty long time ago. In order to engage with the students, Chris Webb used active learning, learning by doing, and collaborative problem solving, all methods that were advocated by Colin Ward and his colleagues in the magazine Bulletin of Environmental Education. The centre included 3 large working rooms, 2 dormitories, accommodation for the teachers, also a dark room and a wet room to process photographs, a media room with state-of-the-art printing machines, a large communal kitchen and administration facilities. The equipment that was available for use to anyone who visited the centre, including recorders, cameras, projectors, and other tools that were not normally accessible for schools or local groups. The learning experience was described as, I quote, autonomous, collaborative, and self-generating, with no right or wrong answer, but a range of beliefs and opinions. The center's ethos was, I quote, a fluid and flexible learning context within which students and adults generate much of the information and opinion on the area themselves, end quote. It was set as an enabling place where the possibilities of participation were meant to be experienced. The city was the resource, and the questions asked were, what is it, how it works, and why? The process would help students realize that architecture and urban fabric is malleable and not God-given. Also, the center was a community forum, and groups like the Tenant Association held meetings and exhibition in their spaces. It was a teacher resource center where teachers could try new pedagogical methods, as you can see here in the picture. But more importantly, the center was an archive of material about the urban environment, available for everyone to use and explore. An example of this center's achievement was a self-built community center that sprang out of an urban trail and a research project done by local kids of a council estate. This community center is still there nowadays, so it has survived the pass of time. Not far from this Urban Study Centre, planner Anne Armstrong set up the Hammersmith and Fulham Urban Study Centre as an extension of the planning department. The centre offered advice, resources, and a teaching base for all ages, as well as a chance to investigate local issues and to take a critical look at the borough. Armstrong created the Planaway Day, and with Lynn Dixon, they did urban trails and researched the built environment with young people, as you can see here in the picture. To disseminate their ideas with local schools and neighbors, they created a publication called Roundabout, just to name a few of their activities. So I offer the stories of the urban study centers to you today as a model not only to engage citizens in the built environment, but more importantly, as a path to unlearn some of the awkward lessons of architectural school, as a space to question our position as practitioners and challenge our professional role. I argue elsewhere that urban study centers and public built environment education have the potential to de-school architecture, making the construction of the built environment accessible to a wider range of people. I believe that in order to achieve social equity in the built environment, we need to diversify the agents involved in its production beyond the white, able-bodied middle-class male. I want to share with you today 4 or 5 readings that have helped me navigate this awkward journey, away from the problems that you see mentioned in the screen, and towards an inclusive design practice, all of which resonates with many of the ideas of the speakers on the event last Saturday. Well, first of all, of course, is Colin Ward and this fabulous book called Street Work, the idea that the school can explode outside and the environment, the learning in the city can be integrated. And as you see here in the picture, you can see Colin Ward and Tony Fison in a 1972 newspaper mentioned as activists. But I just also want to mention the work of Ursula K. Le Guin and her carrier bag theory. I think that this is a fantastic read to fight our desire to be the hero of the story and try to think about telling stories otherwise, like if it was a bag full of different contexts that are entangled and mixed. Also, I want to bring in Ivan Illich and his book, Deschooling Society, as a way to question institutions and the status quo. We sometimes approach things as they are set in stone, but I think that with Illich, you can learn that things are quite flexible and how we can use like different learning environments to expand our notions of the city. I also want to bring in Donna Haraway, who talks about situated knowledges, something that Enrique mentioned as well on Saturday. And this invites us to reflect also about our own position and how knowledge is created from our perspective, and to acknowledge as well that there are multiple knowledges which can be complementary, something that Ruta Cuatro, another group, mentioned on Saturday. And finally, I want to bring Gloria Ansaldúa, who in Borderland talks about the multiple selves, and this idea to resist classification, which I think that resonates with a lot of the comments and the conversation that was had on Saturday, in the sense of if you feel we don't need to carry the title of architect as a single classification. We're much more than that. We're citizens, as someone said in the event on Saturday. And I think that with that comment, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sol, for your
stop sharing.
Yeah, maybe so we can have more like a proper talk. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Sol, for such an amazing presentation. I want to also acknowledge that I started this journey of kind of understanding what I wanted to do with my MA after reading one of your articles, Deschooling Architecture. It was very interesting. I didn't know about urban study centers and what they were doing, and it was like, oh, I need to do that. I need to create a space like that. And this week I have been rereading and kind of formulating my final portfolio for this thesis project. And rereading your text and seeing your presentation again remind me on that moment, awkward moment of like, I'm going to make a study center in Colombia and see what happens. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. Now I wanted, maybe we can have more like relaxed conversation for maybe 20 minutes and then open the room for comments from the audience. As you were saying, I think one of the very interesting kind of given aspect of what happened on Saturday and of your presentation is this idea of how architecture and buildings, like we as these kind of awkward practitioners, we don't see them as solid objects, as well as one of the kind of participants were saying, but as you were saying, these kind of malleable structures of many stories that happen, and how how these buildings and how architecture is composed also by many stories and by communities that are engaging in constructing and coming together. Maybe you kind of already answered this question through your talk, but what is this moment that maybe we can discuss a little bit what is this moment where you felt like really uncomfortable and you saw this as an opportunity to generate something more and cross this kind of disciplinary boundaries that was shaping you as an architect?
I guess that, well, I addressed it a little bit in my talk. I think that it's super interesting how you're framing this as awkward practices, because I guess that it brings out how difficult it is to be in a middle ground. And I think that that's something that I want to talk about with you, you know. I guess that it's easier to follow a traditional, you know, role model that you've been taught, you know, with architecture school in a way sets it up, you know, and then you have all these people practicing in certain ways. But when you feel uncomfortable with that, you want to move away from it, then how you do it, you know? And I think that there's like, that's why I was describing it. We were talking about it with a friend yesterday, Sebastian, and we were talking about how it's like jumping into a void, you know, because you have no idea. You know how to do buildings, and I felt quite comfortable doing buildings. But then moving into this middle ground, like what are the tools? What can we use from architecture? And I guess that's something that I keep reflecting is, what do we take from architectural training? What do we take from architectural school into this different way of practicing? And what do we have to get rid of? And that's why I put all those words in the presentation, you know. I think that naivety has been a big one for me. You know, there's a lot of naivety when you come into this kind of heroic idea, I'm going to make people engaged with the built environment. And I guess that it's fine. And I've come to accept that in the 70s, people felt exactly the same way. And part of that awkward journey is realizing that that kind of heroic, linear idea of how things change is just a construct, as the carrier bag theory proposes, you know, and that we have to engage otherwise. And that's when I think, in my view, feminist theory becomes so important, and social material approaches as well, to understand that everything is entangled, that you can't like decide to like change something and go there. It's just simply not enough.
Yes, I think that was one of the comments. One of the participants was saying how, as architects, we're trained that we're going to a site, and even we see the site as a AutoCAD boundary, a square on a map plan, and just gonna your first thing kind of as this naivety and heroic act as like, I'm gonna change the word, designing this amazing building for the community. And I think one of the first kind of awkward moments, and I had this in my previous kind of architecture practice, professional practice, was like, I was always talking about community, and community was this object. And like, this is going to be filled with community events, and the community is going to be here, and they're going to have a lot of fun, and they're going to learn and engage. But then I was just making drawings, and I remember for a specific competition that my boss was, you have to make this a very exciting place. So in the plan, I was drawing many people and objects and fun, but then it's like, this is not going to happen. The architecture is not an answer to transform, I guess. And that was one of the kind of very important kind of discussion on Saturdays, like communities in the architectural practice and are being so objectified, and this idea of community participation, as you were mentioning, that happened in the UK. Like there is a law that you have to engage with the community, but that law didn't guarantee any action from the community. So how these kind of centers become spaces to train or to really engage the community.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I really enjoyed that part of the conversation on Saturday about community and collectivity, and how I remember that Ana from Arquitectura Expandida, she was talking about how we tend to romanticize the idea of community. And for me also, there's this contradiction of community, because a community means that it's not everyone. A community is a set amount of people, and it has boundaries, and some people belong to a community and some people don't belong to a community. So this romantic idea that community is everyone is impossible, you know, and that's when, again, situated knowledge is, I think, that becomes a really good way of thinking about this, you know, like communities are based somewhere, they're people, they're bodies, you know, and we have to address that situatedness of those communities. And I really liked how Anna was talking about collectivity instead, because you decide to form collectives with others, no matter who they are, where they belong to, and it doesn't mean that they have to be based in a certain place. So I thought that that was a very productive point of the conversation last Saturday as well.
Yes, I think, yeah, the idea of thinking of collectivity instead of community, because, and I want to go back a little bit when we first met each other in a couple of months. You were saying you shouldn't really understand what's this community, because once you're working within Cajicá, because once you said community, you are excluding a lot of people, no? Because as you were saying, there's these boundaries. And precisely this kind of idea was explored in the talk on Saturday, and as you were saying, how we have to think, and kind of these kind of talks, this talk on Saturday and today, instead of thinking of this kind of community of architecture practices, maybe it's a collectivity of architecture awkward practices. And I wanted to tell you that after Saturday, kind of on the backstage of everything, we've begun to create a Google Doc with this idea of how we can create this network or collectivity to begin to collaborate together in kind of all of the discussion. On Saturday, the event was supposed to last an hour and a half, and the conversation extended very long for 2 hours and a half. Very interesting, because everyone was so excited to talk about, and many of them didn't really know each other. So it was a moment of encounter and this kind of moment of, okay, we're thinking and sharing so many things. And even though we're based in different cities in Colombia and we're totally distant right now, how this kind of moment can begin to generate this collectivity. So from there, kind of the idea from is that we're using this transcript of the talk as a Google Doc to generate kind of a shared document to share these ideas.
I think that it's just amazing, because it's so similar. Like in the 70s, the Urban Study Centers is a network, you know. It was even some interviewees. I've interviewed 24 participants of this network. They call it a movement as well. And part of the importance of it is that they all had familiar practices, but they were not doing the same. They were all like different disciplines and different backgrounds, different contexts, but they came together to discuss, to share practice, to try to grow the movement, to help others set new centers, you know. And I think that was very important, as well as the idea of the working parties, which was another thing that really happened during that time, that it was architects and teachers coming together to work in several projects all around the UK. And so I think that it's great to hear that you're kind of doing the same kind of network approach towards these practices, because it's quite many people describe it as quite lonely and a very difficult work, because you don't know how to do it. And by getting together with others and sharing practices, it really pushes the work forward.
Yes, totally. I think that this moment of recognizing this kind of awkwardness was a really interesting moment for everyone. And as I mentioned, this idea of awkward started with a conversation when we were planning this talk with Ana from Arquitectura Expandida. And they're like, okay, I feel so awkward with my role as an architect today, because I have this practice that is not doing buildings exactly, but also I'm teaching at the university in Colombia, where students are judged basically for their forms or their buildings. So I'm being kind of this confusing moment. And she's kind of in this kind of really in between, and she's this kind of people that is translating between the formal practice and kind of the urban. And I really wanted to also comment to you this idea of translation, of being here in the UK, looking to the urban study centers and this experience in the 70s in English, in this very context and site, but also reflecting to your kind of awkward moments in Chile and that practice in Spanish and in another continent. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of these confronting and mediations?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question. It's, of course, and that's why I brought Gloria Ansaldúa to the presentation. I think that Gloria Ansaldúa, in her beautiful work, she mixes English and Spanish. You know, these two tongues, and how she talks about how you have this simultaneous brain. You know, they're both working together, and I feel kind of that has that division in a way, and at the same time that coming together is really interesting because I went out of Chile looking for new models of how to do this because I couldn't find in Chile practices. By doing the work in the 70s in the UK, I discovered that in 1972 in Chile there were very similar practices, but they just, unfortunately, they finished with a coup, with a military coup that we have in 1973. So for me, it became a project very close to home as well, even though I'm so far away researching this 1970s British practices. It was just also because in my country, those practices that were developing as well were stopped, you know, and in a way the story didn't complete, but it did continue in the UK. So it's interesting this back and forth and how, for example, for me, researching the urban study centers allowed me to create my own collective in Chile and start my own nonprofit organization in Chile and do these practices, but informed and I guess that's supported by the lessons, the historical lessons of all these people that have done it before me. And I guess that I feel more comfortable now and less awkward because I do have their voices, you know, and interviewing all these people and learning from their experiences and because they did this work 50 years ago, they're quite critical about it as well, you know, and I think that they have raised many issues that for me weren't that clear when I started with this project. So it's been really interesting, this back and forth. But of course, it has its problems as well, you know. I'm still a Latin American woman doing British history. That's not without friction.
Yes, very awkward moments, I guess.
Yeah, very awkward indeed.
So thank you. It's like a really pleasure to talk about you. I wanted to open maybe the space for the audience if they have any questions or comments. The chat is open. I don't know. Maybe Henrietta says hi.
Hi, Henry.
So Sarah, I'm gonna read out loud. Sarah, she says, very interesting as a multimedia artist and creative practitioner working with architects and urban planners. I often felt awkward and unqualified even. How to reach the gap and aim the collaboration, teaching and unlearning more equal in terms of language, practices, and projects.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for the question. I think that language is key. If I understand well your question, I'm not reading it, so but I think that one of the problems that I found working with educators in the UK, and obviously being this is my second language, this is not my first language, you know, the issue of language becomes key. And at the beginning, working with teachers, I found that it was very hard to communicate. It felt like I was speaking a completely different language. And in order to have communication and meaningful communication, you need to share the same language. So it took me years to participate in classrooms, you know, to hang around teachers. I guess it is really important, the long-term engagement, to understand and create a common language, you know. And also, I guess it is really important to get away from disciplinary silos where you're very embedded in your jargon. You know, we all have jargon because every discipline has their own jargon, their own words. And then if you get into theory, then it gets even worse, you know. But I think that in order to establish that common ground, especially in my case between educators and other people interested in the built environment, is try to have a long-term engagement so you can create a common language. At least that's what I think.
Yes, I want to add that one of the comments from Saturday And kind of this idea of kind of these awkward practices too is kind of, they're dealing with different languages that don't really, they inhabit the same spaces, but they don't speak the same tongue, maybe. So we have this kind of the language of the street, of the barrio, of this kind of people that are taking different approaches to space. And then you have the language of the institution that is building the former city. And one of the kind of questions of the projects it's presenting there is kind of dealing with these two language and how you have to be this bilingual in kind of these practices, but also as Sol was saying, is one of the first steps is you have to step out of your kind of disciplinary boundaries and start to negotiate and mediate between those kind of languages. Yeah.
And taking maybe now that you mentioned mediation, I think that what I've tried to develop in this years as well is to learn how to facilitate. And I think that this is when you really have to take your architect armor off, you know, and get out of your comfort zone and really concentrate and not putting your voice in the spotlight, rather than creating spaces and activities and dynamics, group dynamics that allow to put the spotlight in others and to learn how to listen. I think that because I don't know, there's something about architecture training with all the presentations and with all the kind of selling points. You know, you're selling the project, you're trying to convince people, you're trying to negotiate. That I think that sometimes your own voice becomes too dominant. You know, so I think that it's important to be aware of that, turn that voice off, and just really listen. And I think that that also allows proper communication in my life.
Yeah, I would really add fast because there is another question, this idea of, yeah, listen. For me, kind of in this kind of personal experience of going through Publico, listen and empathy are kind of these important moments of to create trust and engage kind of in this kind of language conversations. So James, he's saying, one common thread regarding participatory practices is that they tend to lose momentum and energy over time. How do we make them more sustainable?
Yeah, I guess that, thank you for the question as well. I think that participatory processes don't lose momentum if they matter to people. So I think that that's something that I've also learned the hard way. Like sometimes you think that you're discussing something that's very important to other people, but if it's not really important, they're not going to engage. And the other thing that I've learned with kids is that if it's not fun, they're going to get bored. So I remember like doing a project with schools, and yeah, it worked well for a while, but after a while, they just said to me, "So this is boring," and it's important, you know. So I think that I've learned that like it has to be an enjoyable experience. It has to be relevant. It has to be close to home as well. I think that most of my interviewees talk about how close it has to be, this issue, for you to engage, to be interested in, to be willing to spend your time, especially for people who have like multiple jobs, caring duties. You know, there's so many pressures on people today. So if you're willing to give your time, it has to be something that really matters to you. And I think that for that, you need to have a long-term engagement. Because if you want to do a one-off thing, it's just going to be like an irrelevant thing. I do think that nowadays I believe in long-term engagement, close to our hearts, and then keep it fun, keep it light. And one interview always says like, bring cake, always bring cake.
In Colombian, we have to bring coffee if you want to start a conversation. Yeah, I want to also comment of that kind of in this kind of practice of Publico, this project practice that it's kind of emerging. One of the kind of first learning of the first month is that I cannot drive the agenda on whatever I think it's important. I come from a different context, and I guess this idea of privilege that you were saying also confronts, and I have a different vision of what should I do. So kind of how the space is now being worked since September more is like communities are the ones I don't want to use community collectives, are the ones that are bringing and making the agenda forward. So they are the ones who are bringing the project and say, we want to do this. Maybe for me, it's not how I imagine this would be, but again, this kind of idea this is what is close to their heart, and this is what is important to them. And from there, I've seen how these kind of moments of activities and creativity and coming together for causes around protecting a river has become interesting and engaging. So the last very question from Olga, and then we come to a close. Olga says, thank you for the really interesting presentation and discussions. Do you think architecture schools needs to change and adapt to this more open and collaborative approach towards architecture? And if yes, what would you consider a useful change? Well,
yeah, I think that yeah, brilliant question. And I guess that's where my interest lies. I do think that we can change the way that we train younger generations of architects by adopting some of these awkward practices and putting young architects in awkward positions as well. I think that even though it doesn't feel great, you learn so much by being in an awkward position and moving out of your comfort zone. And I do think that deschooling architecture is an important thing, like trying to in a way blur the boundaries between architecture schools and the outdoors. And I think that many people are doing this around the world. You have, for example, life projects. Life projects is when you teach architecture using projects that are with real people, real clients happening outside, and you learn in real world conditions. And you have, for example, nowadays urban rooms, which is like a new version of the urban study centers that is happening in the UK, where architecture students get to engage with community issues as well. It's something that I know that UCL also is planning to integrate in the new campus. But I do think that we need to shake a little bit architecture education. It's been going on for quite a while in the same kind of model, and I think that we need architects to adapt to the extreme needs of the world now, like climate change, social justice, and for that I think that we need new types of pedagogies.
Yes, I would totally agree. I was thinking kind of back to the context in Colombia, where the like architecture's discourse is talking about more about form, materiality, and when you go to their reviews or classes, most of the discussions are about this is a nice door, you have the right window looking through the south. And although I think that discourse can be sometimes interesting, I think it's becoming, and then you see how Bogota is this city with so many problems and things happening and these kind of informalities. And instead of having the schools looking towards those moments, you see those talking about this gaze of architecture towards something that's very formal in practice. So I would totally agree that it's really nice to have some shaking moments.
But I do think that it's important, to think about formal issues and aesthetics. It's part of our training as well, It's like, but I guess that the thing for me is how to combine that with a more open approach, Like I would like architects not to be trained to control, not to be trained to be the hero, not to be trained, to just be more aware of what is the kind of baggage that they're bringing into the projects, and then to allow to in a way lose control a little bit and diversify the kind of people that get involved in a project.
Yes, totally. That reminds me a lot of like reading kind of a very the open work by Eco, kind of this opening the practice, and you have multiple actors that are manifesting and creating these stories together. And losing control, very important.
Very important, yeah.
So thank you, Sol, for sharing this moment with me, for all your hard work and inspiration towards this project, and for everything that you have given me on this kind of 6 months of intense work. It's been a pleasure, and I'm really honored to have you here, and thank you again. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for inviting me. I think that this is why we research, you know, to be able to share this and to hopefully create new practices. So for me, it's an honor as well that you took it forward. You know, that's the nice thing about it.
And thank you for the audience and the thoughtful questions and comments. So bye. Have a nice evening.